Matthew chapter 19. This is week 26 this year in the book of Matthew. We've spent more than half of the year. We've had some pauses for other series, but more than half the year talking about Matthew. Week 46 in total. And you might wonder sometimes, are we ever going to finish the book of Matthew? And let me answer that clearly now. Yes. But maybe not this year. But yes, we will finish the book of Matthew. And some of you, I guess Laura's the only one in the room, who remembers our study of the book of John on Wednesday evenings, which went for easily a year and a half, if not 2 years. But it was interesting, and you learned so much, as did I. So, okay. Just have one review question. Jason had talked about the accountability process, and it was even one of the Bible Jeopardy questions. If my brother has wronged me or has committed a wrong, then I would talk to him individually. Second step, I would bring 2 or 3 brothers, and then the third step, we would bring it to the gathering. That's the accountability process that Jesus outlined in Matthew 18. But what's the goal? What's the goal of the accountability process? Restoration, yeah. Well, I'm going to use the word forgiveness. Yeah, see, there's a font that's not. Anyway, forgiveness. Jesus told the story of the unforgiving servant. The goal is forgiveness, that brother will be forgiven, and restoration to the gathering. So that's the goal. All right. I don't know if I would say it's a fun topic today. I would say it's actually more of a heavy topic today, and that is divorce. Matthew 19, verses 1 through 12. So let's read this out loud together. Now, when Jesus had finished these sayings, he went away from Galilee and entered the region of Judea beyond the Jordan, and large crowds followed him, and he healed them there. And Pharisees came up to him and tested him by asking, "Is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause?" He answered, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, 'Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother, and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh.' So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate." They said to him, "Why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and to send her away?" He said to them, "Because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning, it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another, commits adultery." The disciples said to him, "If such is the case of a man with his wife, it is better not to marry." But he said to them, "Not everyone can receive this saying, but only those to whom it is given. For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let the one who is able to receive this receive it." All right, there's a lot in there. We're going to start with this little geography overview. One of the Bible Jeopardy sections was geography, and Jason had a map about like this, right? That everybody who was there Friday night saw the map with the Mediterranean, the Dead Sea. So we're going to do a quick geography review because we have this statement at the beginning of the chapter, which seems like it doesn't mean anything, but it's actually really significant. So a quick review. I circled Capernaum here. Capernaum's on the north side of the Sea of Galilee. Capernaum was Jesus' home base. During his 3 years of ministry, I would say that he spent more time in and around Capernaum than anywhere else during that 3 years. And then a few weeks ago in Matthew 16, we talked about how Jesus and the 12 disciples went up to Caesarea Philippi. They traveled up there, and in Caesarea Philippi, the Transfiguration happened, which I drew there, illustrated, beautifully illustrated, I might add, as a 3-year-old might. And but in Caesarea Philippi, Peter made the statement, inspired by the Spirit, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And that's sort of the apex of the Gospel of Matthew. And immediately after that statement, Jesus began to talk about how he must suffer. The disciples didn't want to hear it. They didn't understand it. Okay, then that's in Matthew 16. And then if you remember in Matthew 17, they left Caesarea Philippi and they returned to Capernaum. And I guess another review question. Do you guys remember what they talked about on their way back to Capernaum? Maybe one of the folks on the couch here. Do you remember what they talked about? Who is the greatest? That's right. Who is the greatest? Which, of course, is a silly question. Silly and pointless question, but that's what they talked about. Okay, so they returned to Capernaum, and then that gets us to today. What we're reading is that Jesus went away from the Galilee, that region around Galilee, and he went beyond the Jordan. So he crossed the Jordan to what Jewish people would have called the other side of the Jordan, and then he spent some time teaching in this land. The map here says Perea or Perea, however you want to say that. Large crowds followed him. Jesus had an unmatched ability at the time to draw a crowd. He could draw a crowd of thousands. The population wasn't even that big, but he could draw a crowd. And his ministry included healing, now included teaching as well. Let's look at the parallel references. So the book of Mark gives us the parallel passage, and it's almost exactly the same. And he left there and went to the region of Judea, beyond the Jordan. Crowds gathered to him again, and again, as was his custom, he taught them. So Mark gives us the same sort of thing. I changed maps. This map has this purple line showing him leaving Capernaum, crossing the Jordan, and spending time in this region of Perea. Luke, in this same passage, this is the parallel passage in Luke, but Luke gives us something a little different. When the days drew near for him to be taken up, he set his face to go to Jerusalem. The days drew near. Everything in this whole story happens at the right time. Jesus came to this world at the right time. And then multiple moments during his ministry, he said, "My hour is not yet come." And then when it arrived, his hour had come. Okay, so the days drew near. The time was approaching for him to be taken up. When Luke writes this, it's almost as though Jesus is looking beyond the suffering, beyond the cross, beyond the resurrection, to the ascension. He's looking towards his ascending into heaven and turning the church over to the disciples. He set his face to go to Jerusalem. This phrase, maybe some of you heard the phrase, he set his face like flint, right? Which speaks to this rock-hard determination, going one direction. And so when Jesus left Galilee, he was leaving Galilee never to return. He was closing the chapter of ministry in Galilee, and he was going to Jerusalem. This oneness of focus. He was determined. Nothing was going to distract him. We think of there's a political election. You probably haven't heard of it. And our political candidates right now, they're counting down 50 days or however many days. They're set. They're pointed towards that election. Or a more comfortable analogy, if you're a student, you look towards graduation. The point of your life is not to be in school forever. It's to get to that graduation, to get that degree. You're set. You're pointed towards that goal. And so Jesus is pointed towards Jerusalem. Now, I would say that at this time when he left Galilee, this is within months of that final Passover, probably less than 6 months until his crucifixion. And so his face is set, and he's determined to go to Jerusalem, to go to the cross, to sacrifice himself for you and for me. And the question for us today is, are we willing to follow? That's the question we're going to start with today, and that's the question we're going to end with today. Are you and I willing to follow him to the cross? The Pharisees came up, and they tested him. And by this point in the story, we know that the Pharisees are the opposition. They're the antagonists. They're the villain in this story. And so they tested Jesus. Now, it's fair to ask somebody's or to discern someone's intent when they ask you a question. It's actually fair for you to sort that out. If someone is testing you, that's going to affect how you answer. Somebody's trying to perhaps prove you wrong or make you look silly. Or maybe they're disagreeable and you feel like you've got no chance of convincing them, you might choose not to answer. And that's okay. If somebody just wants to make you look silly, you do not owe them an answer. Or if somebody is hardened to the gospel, you can just tell him, look, as we talked to, I'm sure you remember the gentleman at the park, and I told him maybe he's a hardened atheist, I would say, and I told him I think maybe our point here is just to convince you that we care about you. I'm not going to try to talk you into anything because I can't. The Pharisees are testing Jesus, and he knows that, so he doesn't owe them an answer. Now they're testing him, so intent matters. Their intent was not good. They weren't actually trying to learn. They didn't really care what he said. They were trying to prove him wrong and make him look silly. They asked him about divorce because divorce was and is controversial. This is a difficult topic. And this isn't a topic which is abstract. This is a topic which has probably in some way touched almost every life in this room. It certainly has touched my life. My parents are divorced. And almost all of you have some probably personal experience. This is a difficult topic to talk about. And they ask him about the law, right? Is it lawful? They're trying to set Jesus against Moses. You're the bringer of grace and peace. So are you going to agree with Moses? Now, perhaps there was some idea in their mind about trouble with Herod. Remember that Herod was a ruler at that time. Herod had illegitimately taken his brother's wife. John the Baptizer had publicly proclaimed that was an illegitimate marriage, and so Herod arrested John. And then ultimately John was beheaded. And so that may have been some of the thoughts going through the minds of the Pharisees, that Jesus made a public statement against divorce and remarriage. That might cost him. Might cost him with Herod. They were asking him a question he had already answered. This is a way you can discern if somebody is testing you. Somebody is asking you something with ill intent. Because in Matthew chapter 5, Matthews 5, 6, and 7, Matthew 5, 6, and 7 are the Sermon on the Mount. Now, I know the book of Matthew is not strictly chronologic, but I would say that the teaching of the Sermon on the Mount probably happened earlier in Jesus' ministry. And at this point, Jesus, his face is set toward Jerusalem. He's in the final 3 to 6 months of his ministry. So he already taught, quite clearly, I might add, on divorce and remarriage. So they're asking him something to test him that he already answered. And so Jesus responds with a little bit of an insulting question. Have you guys read the scriptures? Now, the Pharisees and the scribes thought themselves the most knowledgeable of the scriptures. They didn't just read it, they memorized it. They would have looked down on Jesus and his uneducated bunch of followers who knew much less of the scriptures. So when he says, "Do you guys ever read the Bible? Heard of the Bible? Read the Bible? The Old Testament? The writings of Moses?" They would have heard that and understood that as an insult. Okay, and then he quotes from Moses. So I want you to notice, they tried to set Jesus against Moses. They said, how about the law? Do you agree with the law? And he says, well, let's go back before the law, thousands of years prior, back to the beginning. And he quoted from, first of all, from Genesis 1:27. And I would say that Moses wrote the book of Genesis. I think Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. They were given to him by God. Some of it he experienced, but Genesis, this was inspired. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. There is one human race, one humanity, but then within that humanity, there are 2 genders or 2 sexes. Please use those 2 words interchangeably. Okay, and then Jesus quoted from Genesis chapter 2, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." Jesus quotes that here. So he quotes twice from the writings of Moses, from creation, and so much of what we understand about ourselves, who we are as humans, who God is, right and wrong, and even the seeds of the plan of redemption are those first few chapters of Genesis. Always worth studying Genesis. Always go back to the beginning. We do this frequently. Okay, so there are 2 genders, male and female. We are to leave and cleave. I use the King James words there. You understand the leave. Now leaving is an emotional change of attachment because for the Jewish people, and actually probably for most people on the planet, up to the time of Christ and significantly thereafter, when a man got married, he didn't leave the home farm. He didn't leave the estate. He built on. He stayed living there, but he was now bonded. He would cleave to or be almost inextricably linked to or attached, glued to his wife. So his primary attachment is to his wife, to this new family, and not to his parents. But he wouldn't physically leave. He would still be there with them. Okay, leave and cleave, and then the two shall become one. Now, I think that's important because Jesus repeated it. So he quoted it, the book of Genesis written by Moses, the two shall become one, and then Jesus repeated it. So the two shall become one. This is sort of mysterious thing that happens in a marriage where two people are one, yet they are two. Two individuals with different desires and different skills, different giftings, but yet a oneness of purpose, even a oneness of identity within a marriage. The two shall become one. Paul, in the book of Ephesians, quotes the passage from Genesis, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. And then Paul interprets it for us. This mystery is profound, and I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church. That in the same way that Jesus Christ is one with his church, the church is the bride of Christ, in the same way that reflective of that, every earthly marriage, the husband and wife are reflective of Christ in the church, or a symbol of Christ in the church. And then Jesus' conclusion, the two become one. God has put them together, so man should not, or perhaps even cannot, separate, because God joined them together. But the should not, we would all agree, man should not separate. So a quick recap. The Pharisees, they're testing Jesus. They say, is it okay to get a divorce? Put him on the spot. And Jesus basically says, no. No, the two have become one. What God put together, men don't get to separate. And so then the Pharisees, then they show their deck of hands. They show their cards. They say, well, look, come on. We know divorce is okay because Moses said it was okay. Our question for you wasn't really if it was okay. Our question was actually, when is it okay? So here's the verse they're quoting. Deuteronomy 24:1, when a man takes a wife and marries her, if then she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house. And the passage continues. Okay, Moses allowed for divorce. But this verse, you can see some lack of clarity in the verse. Indecency, some translations will use the word uncleanness, would include the idea of sexual sin. So if there was sexual sin present, then Moses allowed for divorce. But then this phrase about favor in his eyes kind of opens it up, makes it a lot wider range of possibilities. If the wife burned the dinner, if she gained 100 pounds and is less attractive, if the husband's not providing, if he's addicted to football, right? If he has lost favor in her eyes, if she has lost favor in his eyes, the Pharisees were actually asking the question, and there were different schools of thought at that time, would Jesus take a very restrictive view of divorce, like it is only permissible when there is sexual infidelity, or would he take kind of the wide open and progressive, if you will, view of divorce, where it's kind of okay for whatever reason? Or maybe no reason at all. We'll call it a no-fault divorce. We'll just say we have, quote, irreconcilable differences. We'll go our separate ways. Conscious uncoupling, as the cliche goes. So they were kind of surprised and disappointed when Jesus gave them that answer. Jesus responds to them. Now he points out a subtle difference. You said Moses commanded a divorce. He didn't command any. Nobody's commanded to get a divorce. Moses allowed a divorce. You're allowed to eat dessert. You're not commanded to eat dessert. You're allowed to drink a cup of coffee, but you are not commanded to drink a cup of coffee. Now, I'm on thin ice there because I just compared coffee and dessert to divorce. And so block that from your memory. But the point being, there's a difference. They sort of overreached there with the command. It wasn't a command. But Moses allowed divorce because of your hard hearts, because of your sin. It kind of makes sense. If a husband and wife have soft hearts, responsive to God, to his spirit, well, there'll never be divorce. They'll get along perfectly. But we live in this world. None of us perfectly reflect what God wants us to be. We're trying, okay? But from the beginning, it was not so. Is all divorce a result of sin? Yes, 100% of it. And God's plan always was one man, one woman for life. And then verse 9, and I'm going to put verse 9 up here. Verse 9 is a little bit of a challenge. Remarriage after divorce is adultery, except for sexual immorality. That exception clause in there. And in the Greek, that's 3 words, except for porneia. It's the Greek word. Now, there are a couple of ways to understand this. There are multiple other passages here, and I have the references there. Matthew chapter 5, Mark 10 and Luke 16 are parallel passages to this teaching with no exception clause. Matthew chapter 5, the exception clause is a little easier to understand. Romans 7 talks about how marriage is a symbol of the law, which lasts as long as you live. And these passages each clearly teach that remarriage after divorce is adultery. That remarriage after divorce is a sin against the original marriage. It is as though when the two become one and God binds them together as one, we can't really separate that. And so if one spouse goes and finds a new spouse, they're sinning against the original marriage. The adultery is a sin against the original marriage. Now, I wrote the word majority here because this concept of all of these passages and harmonizing this with those other passages was the majority viewpoint for 2,000 years. There always has been a minority viewpoint. So the minority viewpoint would be taking the exception here, except for sexual immorality, and interpreting it like this. That when Jesus said except for sexual immorality, what he was saying was that if there is sexual sin, then both parties are free to remarry. That's been a minority viewpoint. Until recently, I would say now that is the majority viewpoint. And so the minority, now majority viewpoint, would take this exception clause and insert it into each one of these other passages. Now, the disciples' response gives us a little bit of a clue to what Jesus meant. So think about this with me. If Jesus had meant, if there's sexual sin, get divorced, you're free to remarry, how would the disciples respond to that? Okay, right? That's cool. Kind of makes sense. Sort of the way we thought about marriage anyway. There was a situation I was aware of. This was a number of years ago in which a young man and a young woman were going in to get married. They were not believers. And they had been counseled that getting married was not a good idea. And they were having second thoughts, the young man in particular. And his mother said to him, as he walked in to get married, she said, don't stress about it. If it doesn't work out, just get a divorce, right? That's what she said. She's also, I guess you would say she's a believer. But that's what she told her son. Now, it will not surprise you to know that marriage didn't last. Definitely takes the stress out of the decision. Now, how would the disciples respond, conversely, if they understood Jesus as saying that if divorce happens, if the two parties separate, then you have to either reconcile or live celibate? How would they respond? Might they respond by saying, well, why would anybody get married? Marriage is such a big deal. It's a very high-risk sort of thing. Why would anybody get married? Because they understood him as saying that if, God forbid, there is an unhappy husband and wife, again, beautifully illustrated, that their choices are either to suffer together or to part ways and live celibate lives. Jesus responded to them by all this discussion about eunuchs. Now, I'm not going to get overly graphic here. Eunuch is a term we don't use very often, but I understand it primarily as being someone who is non-sexual. And Jesus listed 3 different categories of people who are non-sexual. Those who are that way from birth. And there are folks who have birth defects such that they are unable to be sexually active, unable to reproduce. This is how God made them. And they can live very happy and full lives, right? Fortunately, there aren't that many people that way, but that happens, folks with birth defects. There are eunuchs who have been made so by men. In Jesus' context, it would have been something they were familiar with, that a king would have a number of men castrated, he would make them eunuchs in order to care for his harem, his wives and concubines. And by mutilating the men that way, then they were safer in guarding. Eunuchs who have been made so by men. I would submit to you that perhaps a way to understand that today would be there are people, men and women, who have been abused. They've experienced perhaps an abuse to the degree that even though healing occurs, they're not ever going to be sexually active again. They've been made into a non-sexual person by the active men. Terrible, but maybe that happens. But then there's this third category. Those who have made themselves eunuchs, those who make a choice, say, I'm going to live a non-sexual life for the sake of the kingdom. Because maybe that's something that isn't for me right now. And then Jesus says both at the beginning and the end of this statement, this is difficult. Now, not everyone can receive this, but let the one who can receive it, the one who has the strength, perhaps has the Spirit within them, who can receive this, receive it. These are divorce rates. Now, it's hard to say what divorce rates were at the time of Christ. We think that they were a bit higher than some of the centuries that followed, but I don't think we have precise data. I really don't. I think that we have, it's theory at best. But certainly divorce has happened. Marital difficulties happened as long as there have been sinful humans on the planet, which is to say, since Adam and Eve. However, what you'll notice, I think it's fair to say, if you extend this line back for like 2,000 years, you're going to see a very low divorce rate. Worldwide, 1%, 2%, something like that. And that was true in our country, in this country. I think this ranking is actually from the UK, but like in the year 1870 in the UK, the entire United Kingdom, there's like 150 recorded divorces in an entire year, in that entire country. Something similar to that in this country. The divorce rate spiked. This is World War II, very stressful, world-altering sort of event. But then in the 60s, divorce rates started to go up. And why was that? And I'm going to blame, I don't blame us, but this guy too. So this is Reagan, and in '69, he passed no-fault divorce. See, prior to this law in California, in order to get divorced, you had to allege or be convicted of essentially either abuse or infidelity, abuse or adultery. And for those reasons, divorce was permitted. But for everything else, society would say, work it out. And then I think the idea here was that this would empower women, or that it would protect women somehow, that women would no longer have to live in abusive situations. I don't know. Reagan later said this is one of his biggest mistakes, a couple decades later. Reagan, interestingly, many of you know this, was our first divorced president. And do you know who our second divorced president was? Trump, interestingly. But I digress. Once no-fault divorce became reality, it spread to the other states, and as some form of this is present in many countries around the world, divorce rates skyrocketed. Did it make everybody happier? No. Now, divorce rates then at some point started to tail off. Why are they going down? Particularly in what we would consider liberal or leftist states. Do you know why divorce rates are going down? People don't get married, that's right. People get married. And so then along with proliferation of divorce rates and the lack of marriages, we have lots of, I would say, broken homes and blended families. This is reality for so many people. And then overall, along with that, we have fewer kids. This is part of the reason. We're no longer replacing ourselves as a country. I give you this information to show you this part of the curve, because what I'm going to tell you about marriage is, I would say, revolutionary or crazy relative to culture today, even relative to the evangelical church today. But I think for the majority of the past 2,000 years, what I'm going to tell you about marriage was widely accepted not just by the Christian church, but by society in general. Here we go. This is my summary, because it's 11:03. A marriage, as God made it from the beginning, was one man, Adam, one woman, Eve, for life. The two become one. They are inextricably linked. And anything else is not marriage. Separation is acceptable if there is sexual sin or abuse. Now, every situation is individual. These are very painful and difficult situations. But I would not ever want someone to stay in an unhealthy or unsafe situation. And there are definitely times that a husband and wife should separate. They should not be living together. This can happen very early on. It can also happen in very, very advanced situations. There's situations, and maybe some of you have heard of this, where a husband and wife, as they reach their 80s and one partner becomes demented. They start to lose touch with reality, and they're no longer safe. They can't remain in the home with their spouse. They have to be removed. It's not even their decision. But we're going to do that for safety. So separation, I'll use the word separation there because divorce is actually a legal distinction. And if remarriage after divorce is adultery, and I believe that it is, then whether or not you use the term divorce and file paperwork with the state, the original marriage is valid until one spouse or the other has died. And I'm going to base this on today's passage as well as all the other passages that we read. Now, we as a church gathering, our goal is we are for people. We're going to support people. We're going to support people before marriage. I think marriage is a good and wonderful gift. I have been so grateful for decades now, 22 years and counting, 22 and a half years for my wife, for our daughters. It's an amazing gift that God gave me. And for our young men and women, I think marriage, if God has that for you, is an amazing gift, and I'm for it 100%. But we're going to support you in that. Now, some of that is our job as parents, to raise our young men and women to be people of integrity, people who love the Lord, people who read the Word and pray. But part of this is helping our young men and women to date in ways that encourage purity, to engage in counseling. I think it's good and right, especially after you're engaged, to have a series of meetings with a mentor, with a pastor, to go through some scripture, to go through some communication tactics. Let's try to set you up as well as we can for a good and successful marriage. We're going to support people during marriage if there are disruptions, if there's difficulty getting along, if the home is not peaceful. We as a church, we want to come alongside and offer counsel or assistance or whatever we can do to help in those situations. Before, during, and after marriage. My mom's divorced, but the church supported her, I think, as much as they could. She remained a member in good standing at that Mennonite church until she moved her membership to the church in Virginia. We want to walk with people who have suffered from this and be their family and be a support and an encouragement to them. And if they're being asked to live a life without getting married again, we as a church, I think we have a role to help and to support in that. Now, there's this response in culture today. It's too hard. It's too hard. What if I'm 40 years old and I'm divorced, and would God really ask me to live the next 50 years single? Would he? That's too hard. That's not realistic. He wants me to be happy. Now, this is a very common excuse offered by the mainstream evangelical church to a lot of things. Would God put a same-sex attraction in my heart that I can never fulfill? It's too hard. He wouldn't do that. He wants me to be happy. Would God expect something this hard of me? Would God expect me to stay in a difficult marriage and work it out? Well, who are you following? Who am I following? And are we following him to the cross? Lord Jesus, we are your followers, and we humble ourselves before you as empty, hopeless, and inviting you again and afresh today to fill us and transform us. And may we want what you want and love what you love and hate what you hate. Transform us into disciples. Thank you that we already are, but help us to continue to follow, actively living out what you've given us. And I do thank you for some strong families represented in this room, and some strong families that have been examples to us. I thank you for the gift of marriage, understanding it is a challenge as well sometimes. Help us to know, each one of us, to know how to receive and how to apply this lesson. I pray this in Jesus' name, amen.